The NBA offseason is one of the most fun times for a lot of NBA fans because of the number of deals, the teams, the players that could change teams, the teams that upgrade their roster overall. And on today's episode, I want to talk about a couple of the players that are going to be the biggest and best trade targets out on the open market this upcoming offseason. We're going to get into all that and more right after this.
Welcome to the number one place for your daily basketball news and analysis, NBA Central.
What's going on, basketball fans? Welcome to another episode of NBA Central, your number one spot for everything basketball related. I'm the host, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at NBA Central Show on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into this content real quick. And I want to talk about on this episode some of the players that could be made available this offseason that really could kind of change and dictate the way that the market does look if these players are moved. And I'll go through my thinking behind all these players being available as we talk through them. And, take this not as necessarily a numbered list or a tiered list at all. I'm just going through the names, no necessarily hierarchy involved in that. And the first player that I want to talk about is Donovan Mitchell. Now, we all know that Donovan Mitchell, who does have 2 years left on his contract, with that last year being a player option, so it could basically be a one-year deal. The Cleveland Cavaliers are almost terrified that Donovan Mitchell is going to walk away for nothing. While at one point earlier in the season, they talked about their commitment to Donovan Mitchell and wanting to sign a long-term deal with him, with New York teams reportedly being on the prowl for Donovan Mitchell, I do expect that the Cleveland Cavaliers, depending on how this season does end, and if they cannot come to terms with not really confident they're going to be able to re-sign Donovan Mitchell, that he could be put out on the open market to avoid the chance of him walking away from that team for nothing and them getting some assets back. And we know that Donovan Mitchell, who is a flawed player defensively, but is a damn good player offensively and definitely can lead your team in scoring, right? And I think with Donovan Mitchell, if he goes to a team with a solid defensive framework as well, that it's going to kind of overcome a lot of his shortcomings. But with Donovan Mitchell's contract being what it is, $34.8 million next year, with those 2 years left on that deal, I do think that Donovan Mitchell out on the open market is going to be a team that other teams bite on, even teams that outside of the rumored New York team's interest in Donovan Mitchell, that they could very well look at adding him. Can score from anywhere on the court. Despite not being a lockdown defender in any stretch of the imagination, he's taken some steps there at times and shown an ability to kind of be better on ball. Off ball, he gets blown up at, and there's some people even with him trying on ball, he's not going to do very much at. The Cleveland Cavaliers, I do think, would love to keep Donovan Mitchell if it's all said and done, but I do think that if the kind of situation around him does not make them feel confident that they're going to be able to re-sign him, that we could very well see Donovan Mitchell moved this offseason. Now, it also could be pushed to the trade deadline to give them a little bit more time to see where that Cleveland Cavaliers team is. But I do expect Donovan Mitchell the Cleveland Cavaliers at some point to really start listening to offers for Donovan Mitchell, at least in my opinion. So if he is made available, he is probably going to be one of the better trade targets out there on the open market this season, and he's going to garner a lot of attention for prospective teams, especially teams that need a scoring punch, some shooting, things like that. Donovan Mitchell can help those teams a whole hell of a lot, in my opinion. Next up, Zach LaVine. Now, this is going to be a more difficult situation because of the situation around the Chicago Bulls, right? When you look at Zach LaVine, $43 million contract next year, 3 years total left on his deal, the last year of that being a player option. And this is a player in Zach LaVine who can be a three-level scorer. We've seen him do it before. He's a player that can be top 10 in the league in scoring, I think. His skill set offensively is amazing. Right now, he wasn't able to really use that a lot last season. Also, the number on that contract compared to the value, especially with the questions around his health, can he stay available for you? Right, that's another thing. And the defensive limitations there. But I do think when you look at it, Zach LaVine is one of the better scorers in the league when he's rocking and rolling. And if it is a team that does need a scoring threat, right, and a player that we've seen, and you guys know I'm a Bulls fan. I try not to bring a lot of Bulls topics over here because I host Chicago Bulls Central. But outside of that, right, that Zach LaVine has been a player that has shown that he can step it up at times defensively. And I think personally, if Zach LaVine goes to a team that has a certain culture, that has a a team that has an expectation to perform defensively, I do think you're going to see a better defensive effort from him. The problem with Zach LaVine is that he's been miscast as a number one in Chicago. And if a team is looking to add a player that needs it, he's a two-time All-Star on top of that. The injury that he did suffer with his foot doesn't seem isn't one that projects to have any type of long-term implications there. And there are going to be teams that do strike out in free agency, naming like if the Philadelphia 76ers do strike out with their free agent targets, considering they only have 3 players under contract, really 2, but we do expect them to pick up that option on Tyrese Maxey. They'd be crazy not to. This is a team, for example, that could be sitting there left with a whole hell of a lot of cap space and a roster that they do need to fill out to try to convince Joel Embiid to end up to buying in what they're doing in Philly. So I do think that, Zach is going to be available. I do think the Bulls are going to, take a look at that trade market, reevaluate is the word I was looking for, that trade market for Zach LaVine. And if he, if they can find a suitor for him, they would be willing to move him. And considering his trade value is looked at as low around the league, a team could really get away with adding Zach LaVine and not giving up a whole plethora of first-round picks. You would have to give up some. Maybe even you can convince the Bulls to take some of those as protected, considering what they're going through and the fact that for them to even keep that team together, they're going to have to trade one of their big contracts. So, it could be a unique situation where, there's doubts around Zach LaVine with the injuries, the contract, and how much he's committed to winning, right, to do the right things that it takes to win. But if you have a team with the culture, if you have a team with a strong head coach, and you're not looking at him to be your number one, or maybe even you're not your number 2 option, he can be expensive. Make no mistake about it, but he could be a player that definitely could help you even with that sizable contract. And I do think that some teams in the right situation may bite for Zach. It's just that what value would the Bulls bite on that deal for, and what the prospective teams that are interested in him, what would they be willing to offer for Zach LaVine outside of matching salaries with some contracts? So, but Zach LaVine's definitely a player that I do expect to be out there on the open market. The next one is a 2-4. I know I said top 5, but we're going to talk about 2 players here, and that's DeJounte Murray and or Trae Young. Now, I do think that the Atlanta Hawks are going to look to move one of these guys. They may listen to the trade market for both and decide between that. DeJounte Murray, for example, $24 million, right? The easier movable contract out the 2 with 4 years left on that, and the last year being a player option. And then you got Trae Young, $43 million next season, 3 years left, and an early termination option on that contract at the end of the last year of that deal, as my light goes out. So when it comes down to it, the Atlanta Hawks are thrust into this situation because DeJounte Murray and Trae Young just don't work together. It hasn't worked out the way that the team expected. They were hoping that DeJounte Murray's brand of defense with his still ability to stretch that floor were going to be ones that really could fit next to Trae Young, and they gave up a whole hell of a lot to bring Trae Young to the Atlanta Hawks. But it did not work out. Even though that team went to Eastern Conference Finals, it's been all downhill for the Atlanta Hawks since then, and that is what's kind of dictating this course of action by the Atlanta Hawks. And so, I think that in the perfect world, would they like to keep both these guys together? Probably. But when you look at it, the fact that they are right up against the luxury tax, right, and this is another team that kind of has that mandate of not really paying that luxury tax if it can be avoided, on top of just needing to pick a better direction for the team, much like some of the teams on this list, specifically the Chicago Bulls, that the Atlanta Hawks thought that they were buying into a direction, and unfortunately that direction just didn't come. And so this is a team that does like to stay beneath the luxury tax, and to do so, to continue to do so, but improving the team, they're going to have to make a major move. And that move may come by either moving Trae Young or moving DeJounte Murray. I think the thing that really makes the determination when it comes down to it is which player can they get the most back for? And Trae Young, with that $43 million contract, while he's a player that has been close, I think he may have led the league in scoring before. Then on top of that, he is still a playmaker and a passer that can get creative with you if you have a team. But I think Trae Young, you have to have a very specific team built around him. You have to have versatile, switchable defenders. You need a big that can catch lobs for him and is that athletic as well and can patrol the paint on the defensive side of the ball. But then you look at the thing that we already knew that the Hawks at this trade deadline were really kind of shopping everyone. Everyone but Jalen Johnson was basically players that they were shopping, even though earlier in the season it was said that they wanted to keep this duo together. But we even know that DeJounte Murray was a player that was out there. Clint Capella, I think, is another player that could be gotten as well. Bogdanovich, I think they could look to move. So, but I think it all comes down to, do they move Trey? Do they move DeJounte? And then what do they really get back in a deal for either of those two? And that could determine how and which way that roster goes. So I think this is going to be on the lookout. I think a lot of teams could be interested in DeJounte, make no mistake about it. At what deal? Because I think, with teams kind of knowing that you have to break up your team because it just doesn't fit, how does that affect the trade market? And then if you do move Trae Young because of that $43 million contract, what type of deal are you getting back to that, and what is the team left with at that point in time? This is a team that played pretty well without Trae Young. Not great, right? Not by any stretch of the imagination. They were a better defensive team slightly, and you could clearly see that DeJounte, at least on this team, is better when he's operating as the point guard and not off the ball. You can say the same thing about Trae Young. So I think the Atlanta Hawks are going to be forced to make a tough decision on their young backcourt. And I think both players are going to have their own market out there in the trade market that could help the Atlanta Hawks decide a new path for their team. And then the next two players I'm going to talk about are on two teams that are clearly in rebuild mode. And the next one that I want to talk about is Jeremy Grant. $29.7 million left on his contract. He has 4 years left. A player option in that last year. Keep in mind, he just signed this deal last offseason. And it's clear now that the Portland Trail Blazers are fully in rebuild mode. And there was some question around if that was going to be when they signed him to this deal. But, with the season that the Portland Trail Blazers had, on top of them owing a first-round pick to the Chicago Bulls, if they make the playoffs anytime between now and 2028, this is going to be a team that's going to be incentivized to double down on their young players, give them times and opportunities to grow under Coach Chauncey Billups. And Jeremy Grant is one that I think a lot of teams could be interested in. The $29.7 million is not what that contract used to be, right? When you're going to a league that you're routinely getting $40, $50, $60 million contracts, in some cases, that $29 million is going to be more easily movable. He's still a versatile power forward who came in kind of, has changed defensively over that time. He's increased his offensive output each year out of the last 4 years as well. He can score. And I think that ultimately it comes down to what the makeup of your team is and what does it make sense. He can make sense for a lot of rosters around the NBA. And because you do have him locked in to 2028, he's 30 years old right now. So, it doesn't really fit the timeline of the Portland Trail Blazers. You need to look to move on. He started off really as a defensive-minded player. He's improved his offense, like I said, every single year. And 40% from deep each in the last 2 years as well. So not on the greatest volume, but Jeremy Grant, while a flawed player, is still a player that can help teams around the NBA. And if the Portland Trail Blazers make him available as they're in asset acquisition mode, I do think that he can help a lot of teams around the NBA. Again, flawed player, but can still help a lot as well. Next up, Jakob Poeltl. Now, this is an interesting player here because he's on a really good contract. $19.5 million contract over the next 4 years. It's a flat contract at that. He does have a player option in the last year, but it doesn't increase at all. So as the salary cap increases over these upcoming years, you actually get more value out of that contract every year that goes by because it's a flat contract. It doesn't increase at all. So he's still a starting caliber center in this league. I think when you look at the way that the center position is kind of coming back a lot in the NBA, and he's a player that has size, has strength, does some rim protection as well, right? And he's not a slouch offensively at all either. Jakob Poeltl is another player that can help a lot of teams in the NBA, especially if you have a really good point guard that can get him the ball. He can finish, and he can protect the paint, and that's what you really need from a lot of centers. Not really a threat to stretch the floor very much at all. And so that comes down to it. And I think it also comes down to what really is the goal of the Raptors. Like, they broke up that monotony finally on that roster that had plagued them for so long, but they still, kind of have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, right? You could see the Toronto Raptors maybe making a deal or depending on the player contending for a playing spot next year. But if this is a team that is gonna go younger, right, is gonna try to get some more assets, right, as they build towards their future, Jakob Poeltl definitely can be on that trade block for the Toronto Raptors, and they could get some nice. I think you got the value there, you got the length of the contract. He's still a very productive player, and you can get something back for Jakob Poeltl, and it just depends on what the Toronto Raptors' goals really are this offseason. But that's my list of players that I do think are kind of going to be some of the best players available potentially on the trade market this offseason in the NBA. Did I miss anyone? Did you think that anyone that I listed should not be on this list? Let me know all that down below. But otherwise, guys, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you guys are following the show at NBA Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, NBA Central Show at gmail.com. And then lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything basketball related. And we'll see you guys the next time I feel like making a video. Probably tomorrow. Peace, y'all.
This has been a presentation of the Breaks Media.